Well, thank you very much for that lovely welcome. And I would like to just dispel any myths right away that I do write journal articles for a hobby and relaxation. I'm very good at lying on the beach as well and doing absolutely nothing. So, well, first of all, thank you everyone for coming along. It's just great. And I'm just delighted to be here. And thank you very much to the conference organisers for inviting me along. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the volume all right? Oh, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm here this morning to talk about a project that we completed about the middle of last year on the stigma associated with problem gambling. And I believe it's the most comprehensive study of problem gambling stigma that's been conducted to date. So it's, while we've been talking about the stigma associated with problem gambling for quite some time, there has been very little research into it, although some research over in Canada by David Hodgins and crew. Before I start the presentation, I'd just like to acknowledge that this project was funded by the Victorian Responsible Gambling Association, thank you. And I'd also like to very much acknowledge my co-researchers on this particular project. It was a large project, went over 2 years, and I'd like to acknowledge the input, considerable input from Alex Russell, Elaine Nusk, Sally Gainsbury, and also Dr. Helen Breen, who's here today as well. And we've presented some snippets of this research in various forums, but this is, I guess, the first public airing, if you like, of multiple stages of this study, and there were multiple stages, and of course I've only got time to cover some of those and some highlights today. Okay, so just as background, we can say that recreational gambling is a popular and socially accepted and fairly normalised activity in the sense that in most countries where gambling is legal, about 60 to 70% of the adult population engages in some sort of gambling at least once a year. But problem gambling, of course, we know or we suspect to be highly stigmatised. And people experiencing problem gambling certainly report that stigma deters or delays acknowledging having a gambling problem, disclosing that problem to others, seeking professional or other help for that problem, and also if people make it into therapy, it can also undermine adherence to a treatment program as well. And we know from various studies on help seeking for problem gambling that stigma is a major barrier to people seeking help. So people like Matt Rockloff in the audience, David Hodgins, I think maybe here, have done some terrific work on barriers to help seeking, and stigma's up there in the top, 1 or 2 usual reasons that people say that they delayed or deterred them from seeking treatment. But there's been very little research, excuse me, into problem gambling and stigma directly, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Okay, so just to start, it would be useful, I guess, if I clarify what is stigma. And I've drawn on a definition here, or definitions, from Irving Goffman, who has written some seminal works in this area, and some other folks. Sorry, excuse me. And sort of combined key components of their definitions into this particular one, which drove the project. So stigma then is a social process which occurs when individuals are devalued and discredited in a particular social context because of a perceived negative attribute which disqualifies them from full social acceptance. So we need to understand, I guess, that stigma is about the reaction of others to people with a stigmatising condition. So it's about, and we'll talk about this some more in the next 40 minutes or so, it's about a process of labelling someone of having a condition, attaching stereotypes to that person or that population, making judgments, negative judgments, and holding prejudices against them. And it's about an undesirable or socially undesirable attribute. And so, of course, today we're talking about problem gambling, but stigma, of course, is alive and well in terms of race, in terms of people's appearance, perhaps obesity, certainly in terms of addiction, mental illness, disability, etc. So we also need to understand, I think, that stigma is context specific. So it varies by culture and it varies by gender. So what might be socially acceptable behaviour for men may not be for women, and vice versa. And we know that it changes over periods of time as well. So we know that even, gambling, of course, if we look back through history, has had times of social acceptance and times of very much non-acceptance. And that affects, of course, how problem gambling is viewed as well. So Irving Goffman talks about stigma in terms of being spoiling someone's identity. And so a social process where a person with the stigmatised condition or attribute goes from being a normal, in inverted commas, having a normal identity, to a socially tainted identity. And then this process of othering tends to happen, where the stigmatised population or groups become them rather than us. So they're the sorts of things that we're going to talk about today. I do want to talk, and sorry, I will get into the actual research and methods and results shortly, but just some background. I'll be talking about 3 types of stigma this morning. Public stigma. So this is a reaction of society to those with a stigmatising condition and the formation of those negative attitudes. So an example, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that these are my thoughts, an example is, that the community may think that problem gamblers are stupid and irresponsible. So that's an example of public stigma. Then we'll talk a little bit about perceived stigma also. So that's the belief that others have passed judgment or hold stigmatising thoughts and beliefs about that condition. And you find amongst many people with gambling problems that they have a strong perception of that stigma that's out there. Whether it's real or not, doesn't really matter if that's what they believe. And so, the thought that goes along with that is that most people believe that problem gamblers are stupid and irresponsible. We're going to talk quite a bit about self-stigma, and that's when individuals with the particular condition internalise and apply those negative societal attributes to themselves. So they internalise those beliefs. So it's, saying, okay, I must be stupid and irresponsible because I'm a problem gambler. And I hasten to add, I'm not saying that is my view of people with gambling problems. Okay, so our overall project aim was to examine the characteristics, causes and consequences of problem gambling stigma, and doing that to really deepen understanding of how and why problem gambling is stigmatised, and particularly how that stigmatisation impacts on people with gambling problems. So the research approach, like all good research, we started with the literature review, of course, and because this, it's fairly early days, very early days in problem gambling stigma research, we kept the methods fairly straightforward. So we did a survey of 2,000 people in the adult community in Victoria, a survey of people with gambling problems. We did in-depth interviews with 44 of those the second lot of survey respondents, and we did in-depth interviews with gambling counsellors as well to try and get a feel for how stigma impacts on treatment and people in treatment, of course. Okay, so when we went to look at the literature on the stigma associated with problem gambling, we could have had a very short literature review that said, well, not much has been done. When we started the study, all previous studies at that stage had been based on student samples, some terrific work and some great insights. While we were doing the study, David Hodgins, Jenny Horch have published, and I'm sorry, David, I left the S off your name in that slide, have published a fabulous paper on self-stigma. There's also been a qualitative study done in Australia, which was fairly small but gave some great insights, and that was done by Annie Carroll and Brian Rogers and Tanya Davidson at the Australian National University. But really there's not much, there wasn't much around to guide us, and so we drew on the literature and the research designs and measures from the considerable literature that's out there on mental health stigma. Okay, so let's now talk about or focus on that Victorian adult community and some methods and results. So the focus of that was on the public stigma of problem gambling. So what were the attitudes and beliefs and behaviours out there towards people with gambling problems? We wanted to look at the perceived dimensions, I'll talk about these things a bit more, perceived dimensions of problem gambling that might affect how much it's stigmatised and the way it's stigmatised. So that answers the sort of why question, why is problem gambling stigmatised? We also wanted to know how that stigma is created, so we were interested in the process of stigma creation. We also wanted to know about how much is problem gambling stigmatised compared to some other conditions. So we wanted to know the relative intensity of that public stigma, and we also wanted to examine how the public stigma associated with problem gambling varies amongst different groups of people. So who in the community are more likely, excuse me, to hold stigmatising beliefs than others. Sorry, excuse me. Now first I just want to give you a little bit of theory to, there we go, to I guess set the scene for what I'm going to be talking about in terms of results at this particular stage. So we started off, or an element of our project was trying to understand what we'd call the dimensions of a condition that affect public stigma. So what are the characteristics of a condition that determine or influence whether it's stigmatised at all and whether it's stigmatised to a small degree or perhaps a large degree. And this was the sort of theoretical framework that we had underpinning this particular stage of the study, or this particular element of the study, I should say. So one of the key characteristics from the literature as a determinant, I guess, of intensity of stigma is perceived origin. And so drawing on attribution theory, the theory is that the perceived origin of a condition determines societal responses to that particular condition. And so the theory would predict that when a condition is seen as caused by an external factor, such as a genetic condition, something that's inherited, something that's a disability perhaps, it's a result of an accident, something that's an external factor that's not perceived to be the person and isn't the person's own fault, the theory would predict that societal responses would be sympathy and pity and helping type behaviours towards that person or that population. In contrast then, if the perceived origin of a condition is seen to be to be an internal factor, so it comes about through poor choices, or it's perceived to come about through poor choices or lack of self-control or being irresponsible or whatever, the theory would predict then that society would feel much more annoyance and perhaps anger and would adopt sort of more punishing behaviours towards that stigmatised person or population. So that's a key characteristic that can influence how much a condition is stigmatised or a characteristic is stigmatised. Another main one is peril, so how dangerous the condition is seen to be to others. So the danger appraisal hypothesis would predict then, not surprisingly, that the more perilous a condition is perceived to be, it's going to likely to elicit a fear and avoidance type response in the general population. Other key dimensions in this particular framework were noticeability, so the more noticeable a condition or characteristic is, the more likely it is to be stigmatised. Course, so if the conditions seem to be recoverable, so it's seen to be reversible, the chances of recovery are high, tends to be less stigmatised. Conversely, if a condition is seen to be highly disruptive to the self, then it's more stigmatised. So they're the sort of, that was one of the theoretical frameworks underpinning our particular study, or an element of that study. So that, as I said, tried to sort of frame our thinking and our questions around why is problem gambling stigmatised. As I said before, we wanted to understand also the process of stigma creation. So how does this come about? And again, drawing on theory and Lincoln colleagues, there's a generally well-accepted process, I guess, in the literature and has come through research in mental health, that stigma, generally begins with labelling. So once we label someone as mentally ill or a problem gambler, it emphasises difference. It emphasises that person or that population or that group is different from us or people who don't have that condition. And people can become defined by their condition, and that then triggers stereotypes. So, okay, this person's a problem gambler, so they must be like, X, Y, and Z. And so we all know about stereotyping, applying beliefs about a particular social group to someone perceived to be in that group. So you're part of that group, you're a problem gambler, you must be like X. That's then followed, according to the theory, by separating or social distancing. So stigmatised social groups are categorised as them in a process of othering, resulting in social distancing from the more powerful us. I've alluded to emotional reactions, so that we would expect, or the theory would predict, pity and helping reactions when the condition is seen to be due to an external cause, irritation or anger if it's perceived to be due to the person's own fault, and fear and avoidance if it's seen as perilous. And then finally, in that process, of course, it can lead to status loss and discrimination. So stigma then provides a rationale for powerful actors to devalue and discriminate against people with that condition, and that can come through in interpersonal relationships, employment opportunities and things like that. Okay, so focusing on that adult survey, we had 2,000 adult residents of Victoria. We recruited them through an online panel provider. We would have loved to have done a lovely big catty survey and representative. Unfortunately, research budgets didn't allow that. But our sample was representative by age and gender and location, and then we weighted that data also to key demographic factors in the Victorian population according to the census. Okay, the measures that we used then were based on vignettes of problem gambling and of other health conditions. And I'll show you one of those in a moment. And this is a very common methodology used in stigma research. Not surprisingly, having talked about that theory, we had measures of the perceived dimensions of problem gambling, the process, those elements in that process of stigma creation, and then we had a whole lot of questions for respondents trying to measure individual difference variables, so demographics, their own gambling involvement, their measure on the PGSI, and how much contact they had had with problem gambling or people with gambling problems. Okay, so in terms of the vignette then, we had 5 vignettes. You can see them there: problem gambling, alcohol use disorder, schizophrenia. We also wanted some controls, and we drew very much on the work of David Hodgins, who'd done some pioneering work in problem gambling stigma in terms of questions and methodology. And I'd like to acknowledge that. We had some controls, subclinical distress, but we also added in recreational gambling because we thought, well, is it just, if we find that problem gambling is highly stigmatised, is it because all gambling is stigmatised? So we wanted that in there as well. Now, if we'd had all that in with all our questions, the survey would have been about an hour and a half, I think, long. So we had to make some hard choices. So the whole sample saw the first and fourth vignette and then were randomly allocated to 2, 3 or 5. And we randomised the order of those vignettes. So this is the one that we use for problem gambling, and I'm not going to read all the others, or that'd be all I'd have time to say. So Dan is a man who lives in your community. During the last 12 months, he started to gamble more than his usual amount of money. He's even noticed he needs to gamble more than he used to get the same feeling of excitement. Several times he's tried to cut down or stop, but he can't. Each time he's tried, he's become agitated, couldn't sleep, gambled again, often preoccupied by thoughts of gambling, gambles more to try to recover his losses. He's lied to his family and friends about the extent of his gambling. So we based that on David Hodgins' vignette that he used in previous research, but we also adjusted it in terms of the DSM-5 criteria as well. And we certainly didn't include all 9 criteria there, but what the number of criteria that you would need, I guess, to score as a pathological gambler on that DSM-5. So that was the basis of a lot of measures, and we had similar vignettes for the other conditions that I showed you. Okay, so let's have a look at some results. I might need to get some glasses here so I can see. Okay, the screen's a bit far away. Okay, so let's focus first of all on the dimensions of our results for the dimensions of problem gambling that we expected, I guess, or theory would predict would affect its public stigmatisation. So again, drawing on previous work, we asked people, how likely do you think it is that Dan's situation is caused by, and you can see a number of response options there. So in terms of mean scores then, the most highly endorsed response was stressful circumstances in his life, followed by the way he was raised, a chemical imbalance in the brain, and you can read the other ones up there. Just in terms of comparison, the main perceived origin for the other conditions, interestingly, alcohol use disorder and subclinical distress were mainly attributed to stressful circumstances in the person's life. Recreational gambling, I thought was interesting, the way the person was raised, and schizophrenia, a chemical imbalance in the brain. So these are just descriptive results at the moment. Now this graph looks a bit complex, but it hopefully isn't. If I just can say that the green bars represent mean scores that were lower than that for problem gambling, and the red ones for mean scores that were higher. So what we can see there is that, with my glasses on, is that in terms of noticeability, that problem gambling was perceived as less noticeable than alcohol use disorder and schizophrenia, but certainly more noticeable than the other two control conditions. Below that, disruptiveness, problem gambling was seen as about equally disruptive as having alcohol use disorder, but less disruptive than having schizophrenia, and more disruptive again than the control conditions. Problem gambling was seen as about equally recoverable as alcohol use disorder, more so than schizophrenia. And then finally down the bottom, peril to others. Problem gambling was seen as less perilous to others than alcohol use disorder and schizophrenia, but certainly more perilous than the control conditions. So overall, problem gambling was perceived as highly disruptive to the self, moderately noticeable and recoverable, but not particularly perilous to others in terms of danger. Okay, we asked people, we gave them a number of options about how they conceptualise problem gambling. And these weren't alternate responses, these were measures on individual items. And you can see there that clearly the vast majority of the population recognises that problem gambling is an addiction. But I'll come back to that point later, because while people recognise that, I think one of the things that particularly came through this research was people don't understand the strength of an addiction. And so there was a lot of, in our interviews, people, were sort of saying, well, other people say just stop, why don't you just stop gambling? So people recognise that problem gambling is an addiction, but I don't think they recognise, the community recognises the power of that addiction and what it actually means for the person. Okay. So I put that in there. It's not the social stigma, it's the mercury. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the process of stigma creation. It takes a little while to think about that. Okay, so Max is laughing. Great. Okay, so after labelling comes stereotyping. So as we said, once we label someone as a problem gambler or as mentally ill, people tend to become stereotyped. And what our results showed, these were the key stereotypes that the community in Victoria attached to people with gambling problems: impulsive, irresponsible, greedy, irrational, antisocial, etc., etc. Nothing too flattering there, I think you'd agree. Okay, the next part of that process then, as I showed you in that sort of theoretical framework, is about separating or social distancing. So we asked people, if you were aware of Dan's situation, how willing would you be to have these various types of interactions with Dan? And it went from something fairly incidental, like having spent an evening socialising with him, up to having Dan marry into your family. So if we look at that particular scale where 0 is definitely unwilling and 4 is definitely willing, we can see that people thought having incidental relationships with Dan was sort of okay, but committed and enduring relationships were certainly not okay. And these were the emotional reactions. I have to say that this actually surprised me. The theory would predict that people would, the people's emotional reactions overall, as in mean scores, would be towards more annoyance and anger and irritation, and perhaps our language was a little too strong in the questions that we asked there. But I was surprised to see that overall the main emotional response was feeling sorry and sympathy and a desire to help the person. So that was a surprising result to us. So this one might be a little bit hard for me to read, especially for me from this distance. Okay, so this was our results on, descriptive results on the status loss and discrimination scale. So this was the percentage of people who strongly agreed with these particular statements. And I have to read off my paper here because I can't read from that distance. Okay, so I won't read all of these particular statements out, but you can see that it's not a particularly flattering picture. So we've got, 40% of the Victorian adult community, or our sample, believing that, only 40% believing that Dan is just as intelligent as the average person, that they would treat Dan just like anyone else, or about 30% said that. Only a quarter would hire Dan if he was qualified for the job, etc., etc. Poor Dan's really not having a good day. 2/3 of women said that they'd be reluctant to date him. And you can see up there some other that, they'd pass over Dan in favour of another job applicant. Think less of, a substantial proportion would think less of people in Dan's situation. So, people with gambling problems, what this is showing is that, we have these, or society and community has these devaluing attitudes towards people with gambling problems. They've never met Dan, it's just a vignette. Okay, so we were, as I said before, and I'm sorry I'm rattling through this a bit because we started a little late. So we were interested in the relative intensity of that public stigma associated with problem gambling. So how did it compare to those other vignette conditions? And so this was looking at stigma from the measure of social distancing or separating. And we can see there that when measured on that social distance scale, problem gambling was more stigmatised, not surprisingly, than recreational gambling and subclinical distress, that was expected, and slightly less stigmatised than alcohol use disorder and schizophrenia. Pretty much the same results when we used the status loss and discrimination scale. Again, problem gambling was more stigmatised by the Victorian community, or our sample, than the control conditions, and slightly less stigmatised than alcohol use disorder and schizophrenia. Okay, so who stigmatises problem gamblers? Can we draw a few implications from that for stigma reduction? So this was looking at, the characteristics of respondents who had higher levels of stigma when measured on that social distance scale. We're doing some further analysis on this, but I thought I'd keep it fairly simple for today. Didn't want to give you a whole lot of regressions and too many numbers and things like that. But the overall results was that greatest social distance from people with gambling problems was desired by those who believe that problem gamblers are perilous, dangerous to other people, that problem gambling is a noticeable condition, that people can't recover from problem gambling, the problem gambling is highly disruptive to self, people who believed it was due to a person's bad character or poor upbringing were more stigmatising. Not surprisingly, people who had more negative stereotypical views of problem gambling and who felt more anger and more fear and less pity. And I think, those results excuse me, can inform some of the public health messaging that we might want to convey convey in terms of trying to dispel some of those beliefs that are out there in the community. That problem gambling is generally not particularly dangerous to others in a violent, dangerous sense. It certainly does a lot of harm to others, but it's not... to be avoiding someone because you think they're going to hurt you is just it just doesn't hold up in terms of reality. I think particularly that notion there that people can't recover from problem gambling. I mean, we know that that just isn't true. And so, you know, do we need some more messaging out there about that? And we know that, you know, problem gambling is not due to bad character, whatever that might be. And so, again, we could perhaps inform some messaging around that. The other points there in terms of groups who desired more social distance are more around the demographic and other characteristics of respondents. So we found higher levels of stigma amongst people who didn't speak English at home, who were more conservative in their political orientation, people who had less gambling involvement themselves, so gambled less frequently on a smaller range of activities, not surprising, and people who had had less contact with problem gambling. And that measure of contact is called the level of contact report. It has varying levels of contact from, you know, seeing a documentary about problem gambling right up to having a partner or family member or actually experiencing gambling problems yourself. So the people who were more, or the groups in the community who were more stigmatising were those who had had less contact with problem gambling. So that speaks to, you know, the potential for increasing community contact with problem gambling as a stigma reduction strategy, or potentially helpful stigma reduction strategy. Okay, there's lots more I could talk about on the public stigma, but in interest of time, I'll move on now and talk about some results from the survey that we did of people with gambling problems. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we had 203 respondents. This was not a representative sample. It's always quite hard to recruit people. So yes, it was a convenient sample. Inclusion criteria were to have experienced problem gambling in the previous 3 years, obviously adults 18 plus living in Australia. 2/3 were male. The mean age was about 41 years in the sample, and nearly 90% actually scored 8 plus, so problem gambling, on the PGSI in the previous 12 months. So most were current, I guess would be, you know, currently scoring as problem gamblers. The mean score on the PGSI was 15 out of a possible total score of 27. As I said, it was a convenient sample. We recruited most participants through previous research participants at the Centre for Gambling Education Research at Southern Cross. These people who had participated in our research before and had agreed to be contacted again to be invited to participate in further research, and then we recruited the rest through good old Google advertising. Okay, so what did we measure? We measured demographics, of course, some measures around perceived public stigma associated with problem gambling, self-stigma, experiences of devaluation and discrimination because of problem gambling, coping mechanisms used, who they disclosed or level of disclosure to others of their problems, impacts or perceived, you know, their self-reported impacts on help seeking both before and after relapse, and a variety of psychological measures that you can see there. Okay, so let's talk about perceived stigma first of all. So how did our respondents perceive the public stigma associated with problem gambling? Okay, so this shows their ratings, average ratings, of how much they saw stigma to be, the question was how much stigma do you feel society attaches to each of the following? And you can see the range there, and you can see that these people with gambling problems or with recent experience of gambling problems saw problem gambling as being more stigmatised than nearly all of those other conditions there, including some that were in our actual measures for public stigma. The exception was drug addiction. So they saw problem gambling as being not quite as stigmatised as drug addiction, but more stigmatised than everything else that's on that particular list. How did they perceive, we asked them about how they saw people with gambling problems to be stereotyped, what stereotypes did society attach to them, and not surprisingly, words like irresponsible, impulsive, untrustworthy, secretive, weak self-control, addictive personality, that they'd be addicted to something else if it wasn't problem gambling, bored and lonely people who are always in debt. So again, not a pretty picture. And we actually had scales in the Gambler survey that were the same as the scales in the Victorian Adult survey, so we were able to compare results. So the Gambler respondents underestimated how much the public thinks that problem gambling is noticeable, recoverable and disruptive, but they overestimated how much the public thinks that problem gambling is the gambler's own fault, the fear and anger that they were likely to experience if they disclose their problem. They overestimated how much the public feels that people with gambling problems are irresponsible, that they want to avoid people with gambling problems, and that they would look down upon problem gamblers. So the picture there, I guess, to summarise, is that people with gambling problems, I think their perceptions of societal stigma are probably worse than the stigma actually is. But perceived stigma is important because this is what can determine disclosure of acknowledgement of a problem, disclosure and help seeking. And that came through a bit, in our interviews, where some people did say, when I finally told my family or my friends or whoever, they were actually much more supportive than what I expected them to be. I mean, some of them didn't get that reaction and some were very much excommunicated, shall we say. But so I think there's an education, some education could happen around this as well if we want to lower help seeking, we want to increase help seeking rates, lower barriers to help seeking, which I'm sure we'd all like to do. We'd agree is a good thing. Then, I think there's some education that, people may be more supportive than you might imagine they're going to be if you shared your problem with them. You might well receive some more social support. Sorry, those little boxes there, I didn't have time, or there's not time in this presentation to go through much of the qualitative, or any really. Sorry for the qual researchers in the room, any of the qualitative research on this, but I've pulled out a few quotes, where they're relevant, and just put them in those little boxes so you can read them there. But some powerful statements were made. One interviewee said, well, the public thinks that problem gamblers are thieves, liars, they've got no life, they've got no family. Okay, so self-stigma, how did our gambler respondents feel about themselves because of their gambling? And again, there's some pretty powerful quotes up there, I think, which I will read a couple of those. So the one in the middle, the two in the middle there, they're looking at you and they're seeing that weakness, and perhaps that's all they're ever going to see. They're never going to be able to see you as successful or well-rounded. And that speaks to that notion that someone becomes defined by their condition, that they're not a person with gambling problems, they're a problem gambler. And so, that's the sole sort of summation of the person. The quote underneath speaks to a similar theme. I don't even want their pity, I just want them to think of me same as others. So even a pitying response, which we would think is certainly more helpful and positive than an angry or irritation or fear response, is still emphasising difference, and it's still othering people. Oh, now I really can't read that one. Hang on a sec. I hope you can. Okay, look, these were just descriptive results on items that asked people how they felt about themselves. So sorry, the question was, how much of or how strongly do you agree or disagree that your gambling has made you feel, etc., etc. And there's just a whole range of negative attributes there. So, we've got over 90% of people saying disappointed in yourself, nearly as many saying you lack willpower, guilty, ashamed, embarrassed, should be able to fix it on your own, shocked at yourself, weak, etc., etc. Failure or loser, stupid, that you're entirely to blame. So this is what people told us they felt about themselves because they had a gambling problem. So it's not a happy picture, I'm afraid. Oh, sorry. Okay, so we asked people about their experiences of devaluation and discrimination due to having a gambling problem. And I'll show you some results on that. So over half of respondents reported at least occasionally being devalued because others thought they had a gambling problem. So they spoke about, or rated that as, they'd had instances of being made to feel or being treated as if they were inferior, not smart, less politely, with less respect, as if they were dishonest, and been insulted and called names. A minority, though, reported discrimination because of their gambling, and, this is probably because so few of them had disclosed their gambling problem. The highest one there was being denied a bank loan because of their gambling, so that was a quarter of people. But, not much else in terms of reported discriminatory behaviours, because most people kept having a problem very close to their chest. And that makes sense when we look at coping orientations that people used, and the main one, of course, was secrecy, not surprisingly. And there were some others there, but secrecy was the main one. And when we asked people who they disclosed their problem to, and the party that received, I guess, most disclosure, if I can put it like that, were gaming venue managers. I should be more precise in that. We asked respondents whether these parties knew about the extent of their gambling. So the highest category there were gaming venue managers and staff. So I've just raised the question there, can venues do more with this knowledge? And we heard yesterday Anna Thomas talking about that issue. Friends you gamble with, none of this is surprising really, but can friends be harnessed more as a support? And then I was actually really surprised how low these other rates were. About 20% felt that their parents would know their partner, spouse, friends, etc., etc. So very low disclosure. Okay, let's talk about stigma, help seeking and relapse. How am I going for time? About 5 minutes? Thank you. Okay. So most respondents had never sought help except from perhaps family and friends or self-help. Help seeking was more common after relapse. And compared to non-help seekers, the people who had sought help had higher scores on the various stigma scales, so higher measures on or results on the self-stigma scale, perceived stereotyping, etc. But we don't, of course, know the causal mechanism. This was a cross-sectional survey, so we don't know that seeking, we hope that seeking help doesn't heighten someone's self-stigma, but it may. Or is it people who have higher self-stigma go and seek help? Okay, certainly we were interested in the relationship, or the notion, I guess, that how do people feel about seeking help after relapse, and amongst the respondents who'd sought help both before and after relapse, the most common response was they felt more embarrassed doing that. And relapses, people who relapsed also scored more highly on the self-stigma scale compared to non-relapses. So that, again, that's not that surprising, but it's a sad story, a sad picture. So who feels the most self-stigma due to their gambling? Okay, so the scores on the and again, I should stress we're doing more analysis on this, and we'll hope to publish some papers around this. But the scores on the self-stigma scale were highest for women, and those whose most problematic gambling form was electronic gaming machines, pokies. So a couple of quotes there from some mature age women, shall I say. One said, "It's probably more acceptable in the male community. Women who play pokies, it's the lowest form," one said. Another said, "Well, I thought they'd be more, they'd support me, but they haven't." She was talking about when she disclosed to her extended family. I'll say, "Look, I enjoy going to the club." And she said, "Then I can see the look of disdain on their faces. Can't you do something better, like clean your house instead of spending the time at the club?" Okay, so female EGM players certainly feel much more stigmatised than other groups. Also, people with higher psychological distress, higher self-consciousness, social anxiety, lower self-esteem, higher PGSI scores, people who had sought help and people who had relapsed. And again, causal directions are unclear, but it paints a fairly powerful picture, I think. Okay, probably glad to know I'm on concluding comments. I have 2 slides that I'll whip through. Is that okay? Yes, okay, great. Okay, look, just to summarise, I think we can safely say that public stigma, unfortunately, with problem gambling is alive and well. It's perceived mainly as due to poor coping skills or poor coping with stressful life circumstances, and is highly disruptive to self and others. And, you know, I mean, it's sort of human nature, isn't it? It's easier to blame and stereotype than it is to understand how difficult it is to just stop, you know, when you're addicted to gambling. As we saw, problem gambling is not quite as heavily stigmatised as alcoholism and schizophrenia, but people with gambling problems think it's more stigmatised than it is. How does it impact on them? Well, as we've said, it encourages secrecy, delays and deters help seeking, undermines treatment adherence, particularly after relapse. It leads to self-stigmatising beliefs, and we saw the extent and the power, the severity of those. So it adds a double burden. Not only is a person dealing with having a gambling problem, and as if that ain't hard enough, they're also dealing with being highly or feeling highly stigmatised about having that problem. And as we said, it's worse for some groups. Okay, last slide, except for the references. Okay, some implications. Look, I do, you know, everyone, of course, when you talk about this, the obvious question is, well, what should we do? And I hasten to add that the project scope did not include an evaluation of stigma reduction strategy, so I'm sorry to disappoint you in that realm. We did, of course, from the counsellor interviews, there were some, you know, sorry, we've got a paper coming out soon in International Gambling Studies that is just on those interviews, so those who are interested, I'd refer you to that. And they talked about the importance, before treatment can even hope to be successful, we need to restore people's self-esteem, enhance their stigma coping skills, encourage a belief that recovery is possible. And we heard that from, sorry, was it Barry Duncan on the first day, talking about you need to give people hope before they can actually recover. And also another very important point, I think, from the counsellor interviews was that we need to be, or counselling needs to prepare clients for relapse. Relapse, as we know, is very common in that road to recovery, and we want people to come back to therapy, to treatment after relapse. So we need to prepare them for that high likelihood that relapse will happen, that is quite normal, that we can use that experience to better understand what your triggers and urges are and behaviours that you might be able to build resistance to that the next time, or if it happens the next time. So if you take anything from this today, I guess the point is that addressing public stigma of problem gambling is highly important, and we need to improve, you know, if we think of that process of stigma creation, we need to improve knowledge about problem gambling so that the public has a reasonably accurate knowledge about what contributes to it, what recovery prospects are like, what people that, you know, people generally aren't dangerous in terms of violent if they have the problem, etc. We need to be careful with our language. Labels are powerful things, and I've been as guilty as everyone else about going, you know, the problem gambler and problem gamblers, and I think, you know, we need to rethink that, and we're very much behind other fields in mental health and other areas in that. Of course, it's about changing attitudes and it's about changing behaviours as well. So certainly we need public education strategies, but we also need to be careful that they're not stigmatising in and of themselves. So some of the images that we have seen, and it's happened more in the past than now, you know, images of people with gambling problems looking derelict, homeless, not feeding their kids, stealing money out of friends' wallets and things, well, that I think probably just compounds the stigma more than... And people with gambling problems they say, that's not me, I'm not doing that, I don't look like that. So it's not a great encouragement to go and seek help. I think increasing community, or what our results would suggest, is that increasing community contact with problem gambling is a very promising strategy. And I think more investigation could be done into that, and we need to look at other fields, particularly depression, for example, where some great work has been done. My very last point is it would be remiss of me as a researcher to not say more research is needed, but particularly around optimal stigma reduction strategies, which, as I said, was not a key focus of what we did. So thank you very much for your patience. I'll put the references up there if anyone is really interested, and thank you for listening.